Mercedes hopes that the third time will be the charm under F1's ground effect regulations with a new W15 that features major changes. Cynics will say we heard something similar last year. But while the 2023 Mercedes was an evolutionary car, this is something closer to revolution, with fundamental changes made to the architecture of the car. Team principal Toto Wolff describes it as a complete relaunch, with significant changes not only aerodynamically, but also under the bodywork. And it needs to be. Mercedes has won just one Grand Prix over the past 2 years, and despite finishing second in the Constructors' Championship last season, it's only very occasionally threatened Red Bull. Mercedes has battled fundamental problems over the past 2 seasons, with a car that's been unpredictable, erratic, and often left drivers Lewis Hamilton and George Russell short on confidence. And Mercedes must get this car right, after, as Wolff puts it, getting it wrong with the new regulations. The W15 will also be the basis of its 2025 car, so it needs at least to have a car that has the basics nailed and that can be developed over the next 2 years if it's to have any chance of getting back to past glories. To do that, Mercedes has been forced to look inward. That's not only in terms of how it works, but also the various design and simulation tools that sent it in the wrong direction. Wolff says it has found plenty of clues to the source of the problems and has aimed to eliminate variables in the process. The question is whether or not Mercedes has, at last, gone in the right direction. If not, and the car continues to baffle and underperform, then there surely will be some big repercussions. The big opportunity presented by the new car was always the chance to change the fundamental architecture. As Mercedes technical director James Allison says, for layout changes, you're generally talking about where the engine sits in the chassis, what geometry of rear suspension you're going to have on the gearbox, and what changes you're going to make to the part that contains the driver. You will remember Lewis Hamilton's complaints about being sat too far forward in the car last year. He argued that undermined his feel in the rear end and led to a lack of confidence. However, Allison felt that this problem would be solved by improving the rear end of the car rather than papering over the cracks by moving the cockpit back. Nonetheless, Mercedes has shifted the cockpit rearwards, we understand by around 10 centimetres. That means it's still further forward than it was for Red Bull last year. This will help Hamilton with visibility, certainly, but it's also likely to be a result of changes to the car resulting from dropping the zero side pods concept in the first half of last year, so there's perhaps other reasons why this change has been made. However, there have been changes that are expected to calm down that truculent rear end. Allison said fixing that spiteful behaviour has long been a big focus. As part of this, Mercedes has switched from pull rod to push rod rear suspension. That's in line with the majority of teams, with only Ferrari and technical partner Haas persisting with a pull rod configuration. It features an increase in anti-squat, shown by the increased vertical angle between the rear and front legs of the upper wishbone. The consensus is the change to push rod rear suspension, which moves the inboard internals to the top of the gearbox, creates the opportunity to tighten up the front of the gearbox. Mercedes will likely have taken advantage of this to increase the aerodynamic opportunity at the rear of the car. If this can produce more downforce more consistently, then that spiteful rear end should be drastically improved. The downwash ramp at the rear of the sidepod has been extended compared to last year as part of overhauling the airflow regime at the rear of the car. Further forward on the sidepod, there's also a more pronounced and aggressive undercut. This should accelerate the airflow and ensure the front corner of the underfloor is worked harder. The cooling inlet has also changed to move to the letterbox shape that has become de rigueur. It's likely that some of the underbody packaging Wolff refers to was required to make this possible. Because of these sidepod changes, Mercedes no longer needs to use the bodywork shrouding the upper side impact structure for aerodynamic downwash. There are also accompanying changes to the engine cover. At the front of the car, Mercedes continues to run pushrod front suspension. This was modified last season to increase the level of anti-dive, but Mercedes will have taken the opportunity presented by the new car to optimise this. More significantly, Mercedes has modified the nose assembly. Last year the nose connected to the main plane of the front wing, but now it has followed the trend by attaching a shortened nose to the second element. This should improve the airflow under the nose. With the shape of the nose also modified to further shape the airflow, the hope is this will improve the quality of the flow to the front of the floor. There's also an interesting design related to the front wing, with the top flap not fully connected to the nose. Instead, this stops short, then appears to be connected to the nose by a small piece of bodywork or connecting wire. We need a closer look at this to be sure what it is and of its legality, but it will certainly allow cleaner airflow to the front of the chassis. There is also a change to the rear wing end plate configuration. This now features greater separation between the top and bottom flap, which should mitigate the draggy vortices shed in this area. Features such as the floor are expected to change, but provided the architecture is correct, the mission for Mercedes now is to develop the car for improved aerodynamic performance. When Mercedes finally gave up on its zero sidepod design and introduced a more conventional looking upgrade at last year's Monaco Grand Prix, it was the culmination of a long process for Mercedes. It started the current rules era with a car that was, as technical director James Allison puts it, hampered by horrible porpoising. The problem with porpoising and bouncing was eased by changes to the underfloor geometry. For 2023, the FIA introduced rule changes designed to reduce the chances of porpoising that included raising the floor edge heights by 15mm. The big decision for Mercedes was whether to, as Allison put it, cash in the 15mm and aim to run the car lower in pursuit of prodigious downforce, or stick with the existing approach. Mercedes opted for the latter. There was far more to the upgrade than just bodywork changes, with floor modifications and new front suspension with a higher mounting point for the forward leg of the top wishbone to increase the anti-dive angle. But what really mattered were the underfloor geometry changes. As Allison says, the conceptual change was all about undoing the conservative decision about ride heights. The Mercedes remained an erratic car over the balance of the season, albeit one that was good enough to finish second in the Constructors' Championship. However, progress was made with this new direction, but the team always knew it wouldn't be fully realised until there was a brand new car. That's because there were aspects of the car that the team lacked the time and, under the cost cap, spending power to fix. Toto Wolff said in the middle of last year that ideally the team would have introduced a new monocoque, while changes such as the switch to pushrod rear suspension were only possible with modifications to the gearbox casing. So really, it's only now with the launch of the Mercedes W15 that the team has finally put all the mistakes made at the start of this regulation cycle behind it, or at least, so the team hopes. If Mercedes has successfully built a faster car in 2024, that will be the hard part done. But then it will need to make the most of the opportunity, and last season there were times it didn't look like the crack world champion race team it has been in the past. In terms of preparation and execution, it has work to do against the benchmarks in certain areas. Despite finishing second in the Constructors' Championship, Mercedes was only the fourth best team over the season in sprint races. Maybe that reflects a deficiency in Mercedes' preparations going into weekends, or how it reacted to the track conditions or weather changing through the event, or just its on-the-day execution. But even though the margins were slim, clearly Mercedes was not as good as its immediate rivals at maximising the Saturday point-scoring opportunities. Another area it left performance on the table last season was in pit stops. Mercedes had plummeted in the official DHL pit stop rankings in 2022 to 8th, and 2023 actually represented a small improvement to, well, only 7th. It's important to recognise that the DHL rankings reward outright speed above consistency, as points are awarded each weekend to the 10 fastest pit stops. But still, the best teams will be consistently fast and therefore show up at the top of these rankings. Surprise, surprise, Red Bull's there, but so are Ferrari and McLaren, two teams who have invested time and resources into better pit stop equipment and practices in recent years. Mercedes was reasonably consistent with its pit stops in 2023, but usually consistently just a bit slow. On average, its pit stops took 3.18 seconds. By comparison, Red Bull's average was 2.64 seconds. Mercedes has actually been saying for a couple of years now that it recognised it was not the best at pit stops and did need to improve in that regard, but that has not yielded the step required. Wolff suggested towards the end of 2023 that having prioritised avoiding very slow pit stops for so long, rather than being the world champion in pit stops, an investment was needed in equipment and science, and that needs to pay off in 2024. And James Allison is confident it will. He expects what he calls the repeatable time of the pit stop to improve this year thanks to changes in the team's equipment. One thing that could complicate 2024 is the fact it is Hamilton's last season. None of us, not even Mercedes, saw Hamilton's bombshell 2025 switch to Ferrari coming. And Wolff has made it clear he was surprised by the timing, with the news dropping on the eve of pre-season before Hamilton had even driven the 2024 car and having only signed a new Mercedes contract a few months ago. That has not given Mercedes much time to come to terms with Hamilton's impending departure, but it will need to manage it as smoothly as possible. Whether Mercedes is good enough to achieve the team's aims or not, Hamilton presents an interesting challenge. If the car is brilliant, and Hamilton rather than long-term team leader Russell leads the charge, will Mercedes be able to throw its full weight behind the driver who is leaving and trust Russell to fall in line? If it's Russell not Hamilton, who has the edge? Will Hamilton play the team game or put himself first? And if the car's bad, will Hamilton's attention start drifting to 2025 and his final Mercedes performances drop? There's no reason the negatives in that scenario have to happen. And the fact this is all out in the open at least means Mercedes and Hamilton can proceed with full transparency about the situation. Wolff has pledged to treat both drivers equally, for starters. Wolff's expectation is therefore that the drivers are respectful enough to work professionally throughout the year. But Mercedes' biggest issue might be just ensuring no curveballs throw things into disarray. Not just from Hamilton being on the way out, but also from Russell being determined to make the most of this opportunity and prove once and for all that he is the future of Mercedes after a mixed season in 2023. But all of these subplots will be secondary to the big question. Has Mercedes got it right? And if not, what does that mean for the once dominant force of F1?